So I'm so excited this year about this theme that we've been doing with Queer AF. And and so like it's just so much fun to think about what it means. And so what I've been thinking about this last week or so as I've been getting ready to teach this is queer as failing. And then wouldn't you know that there's some academic who wrote a book called The Queer Art of Failure. So if you're an academic and you know that book, my apologies, because I didn't find that out till just like this afternoon. And so I loved it though. I found out a little bit about it and The Queer Art of Failing. And I think that, queerness is inherently has this aspect of failing in it. Because if you think about success in our culture, in this trajectory towards success being, as we were talking about, like accumulation, and there's even some element of conformity in success. So that when we're talking about queering, we're taking something and we're sort of making it a little odd or making it a little strange. Or I always think about, like, if I were standing on my head, that's like looking at things from a different perspective, that I'm queering it. And so there's some way that we can be seen as deviant, and that we are also coming together in ways that we are creating communities in new and odd ways, you might say. And there's a way that is, I think, in the best sense of the word, that we as can see queering in our lives as challenging and deconstructing and really kind of disrupting structural power as it exists. And so I like to think about this queer as failure, this way that we can fail in creative ways to disrupt these. Oh, good. There we go. I was just realizing that when I was looking it up, the person now goes by the name Jack. So they were, I'm not sure what their pronouns are, but they were Judith when they started the book, but now they're Jack, which is so queer. So that's perfect. And so I think that queering is a way that we can engage with ourselves and engage with each other from this way that really is, to me, it's really whole. It makes me feel whole. So often in my life, I've been taught to like leave out parts of myself, that in order to be somewhere, I have to, take out a part of myself and not bring it there. And I remember my mom actually saying, when I first came out in the 80s as gay, that she's saying to me, well, can't you just leave that part when you come home? And like thinking about, well, like, where do I, what is it, which part do I cut off and leave? Where does that exist within me? And so this way of like really this wholesome in that way, not wholesome necessarily and how it's been taught to us what's wholesome, but this wholesome way of looking at ourselves, that we can really lead from a place of love rather than a place of conquering and power over. So if we think about failing fabulously, which I think Queer AF is failing fabulously, it's, something that is inherent in being queer. Because if we are to think about heterosexual patriarchal normativity of getting married to somebody who is of the opposite, which there's such a thing of the opposite gender or sex, then that would be sort of the structure. And so if we are queering it, then we're failing because we are not living up to the societal standards. And how wonderful it is that we aren't doing that. Can we just celebrate the fact that we're not living up to societal standards, that societal standards are actually not going to bring us happiness, which we look at through a Buddhist lens of like, what actually is going to bring us happiness? Conforming to ideas of who we should be or what is success, that is this trajectory of accumulation, is not going to bring us happiness. And so I love this way that we can think of ourselves as failing fabulously. And then Quentin Crisp, who many of you know as an actor, said that if at first you don't succeed, failure may be your style. So, like, let's just bring this on, this way that we can fail fabulously. And so that we can free ourselves from the patriarchal, heteropatriarchal behavior, and that we can really reach into the vitality and the creativity within ourselves. I was recently visiting, so grateful that I was able to go and spend time with my family of origin. And one of my nephews, who's now 19, said to me, and, and he was like, "It's so cool that you're old and you are non-binary." And I was like, yeah, it is kind of cool. This is just the way I am. This is how I've lived. And I think it's great for him to know somebody who has lived in a way that provides possibilities and ways of being, of expression, and the possibility that maybe there is more than what was provided as an example of how to be. In Buddhism, one of the ways that I feel supportive in this idea of really living into my own vitality and creativity, and some people might use the word authenticity, although that tends to be overused these days, but really like this sense of this one here is this term that some of you may have heard of. It's called mana, M-A-N-A, and the translation is often pride or conceit. And there's a different way of looking at this, and so I just want to explain it a little bit. But mana means it's the aspect of identity which is measuring. So mana is actually measuring. And you can measure yourself against others in three ways. When you measure yourself, you could say, I'm better than, or you could say, I'm worse than, or you can say, I'm the same as. And so in Buddhism, what I love is that generally we just start with the first two, like, oh, you shouldn't say you're better than, you shouldn't say you're worse than. And there's a real line towards conformity. It's like we should all be the same. But actually in Buddhism, there's this sense of like, I am equal, like I am the same as, is also a sense of conceit. Because inherently, we each are unique according to the causes and conditions of our upbringing. There may be habit patterns of society or of your family that are similar, but we each have this different construct. So consider myself, I'm exactly equal to somebody is thought of as a conceit. So this to me is really helpful because it helps to remind me that I can't actually follow someone else's directions. Like when somebody says, this is the way you should do it, this is the way it's always been done, and then I can kind of bring this querying in of like, let me consider that to see if it actually works for the circumstances that I'm in. And so one of the things that has been really helpful for me with this idea of measuring is this comparing mind. And so in Buddhism, the idea of comparing, of this judging, of this measuring, it's definitely an aspect of mind that we've gotten a lot of training in. And I think it's helpful, if you're going to get a new iPhone or you're going to buy a car, you want to kind of measure like, miles per gallon. I want to measure, I want a clearance or the size of the trunk. But when it gets to your own sense of well-being, measuring ourselves can really be detrimental to, who we are in the world. So I think that the comparison in general is antithetical to what we think of as mindfulness, And one of the definitions of mindfulness is non-judgmental awareness. So if we're being mindful of something, then we're not being judgmental. We're bringing an awareness that is free from the judging, free from these habit patterns that we've learned. And so one of the phrases that has been really useful for me through that I learned, it's from Krishnamurti, who is an Indian philosopher. And I read this years ago, and he just said, comparison brings suffering. And so when I begin that habit pattern in the mind that says, oh, that person's better, or I'll never be as good, or I can just bring in this phrase of like, comparison brings suffering. And I remember, oh, if I engage there, I know where that's going to end. They're going to be better. I'm going to be worse. Some shame, blame, boom, boom, boom. And so that has been such a helpful phrase for me to disrupt this pattern of measuring that I was taught so well to always engage on, let me get ahead. It's one of the myths that we're taught in our country, that America is the land of opportunity built, by rugged individuals, where anyone with grit can succeed if they just pull hard enough on their bootstraps. This individual success. And it's a myth. And not only is it a myth, but it's part of these what often are called white supremacy characteristics, which uphold white supremacy in our culture. And so the sense that we are doing this as an individual, that I am better than, really doesn't pay attention to all the ways that we're interconnected. At the end of the meditation, we pause for a moment to reflect on the ways that we're interconnected with other people, and even with the plants and the animals and the air. And so if we can remember for ourselves these myths of what success is, that I can do it by myself, that I will be successful and I have nothing, then we can remember and really bring our inquiring mind into kind of disrupting and queering, if you will, the picture. And so I think that this is part of where some people don't really get that mindfulness has this element of reflection in it. And so there's a quote about mindfulness by Bhante Hanapala Gunaratana, who is a monk that comes to the States a lot and teaches at Spirit Rock. He's from Africa. And he says, mindfulness is the state of mind which reflects upon itself, not to get caught in greed, hatred, and ignorance, which cause suffering to yourself, to others, or to both. So mindfulness is this aspect of mind which can see clearly. And we can use these lenses to see where, if we're caught. So we can see if we're caught in greed. Am I being driven by this wanting mind? Am I being driven by hatred of, not wanting? Or just being driven by like this kind of like head in the sand, just not wanting to know? All three of those which cause suffering. And we can use our mindfulness to reflect upon itself, so the mind can reflect on the mind. And just a reminder that oftentimes we think of the mind as being the same as our brain, but in Buddhism, the mind is a translation for the word chitta, which is the mind and the heart. So it's not just an analytical mind, it's this whole embodied way of being. So when our mindfulness is reflecting, we're not just doing this reflection of like, we're kind of checking in with the body and beginning to know what it's like when the body feels like it's moved by greed. What is happening in the body? Like for me, I could just feel like when I want something, my whole body leans forward and when I don't want something, the hatred or aversion, I'm like moving away, or contraction. And ignorance can just be sort of that fog. Or investigate for yourself to see how these show up for you, because it can take some while to feel the manifestations of how is it for you when this mindfulness arises alongside of all these different things, and bringing curiosity. So one of the things that I think that mindfulness can do in this way of disrupting things is helping us not make assumptions. So be like, well, I think that's why. And just pause and bring curiosity. And then noticing the inclination of the mind. Maybe it will start wandering off, but what's happening, and bringing it into the body, to like, what is the thought that arises with that, and bringing questioning to it. Like if we think, oh, I'm not good enough. Just pause and bring curiosity, and not maybe add on the shame or the blame, but just bring pause to that. Creating some space. Just like in our rooms and our houses, we might sometimes, want to move the space and kind of shake up the space. So we move the furniture around. So we can kind of see the furniture, and kind of just what's the space around it? What else is there? What else is happening? So what is the larger container of our practice? And then if we are finding ourselves moving in this way towards, perhaps towards greed or wanting, what might be a way to be generous? And some of the places I think are most powerful is like, what would be generous to myself? How could I be generous to myself in this moment? So this idea of, when things don't work out, that there might actually be something in there that could spark innovation or curiosity, or this failure could actually flip things on their head and provide an opportunity that was never imagined. There's this wonderful quote by Rainier Marie Rilke, and it's from the book Letters to a Young Poet. He wrote all these letters to this 19-year-old, and from one of the letters that he wrote is this quote about this way of, we have to, curiosity. And I love it because he's writing to a 19-year-old, but he calls the 19-year-old, and he's an older man at this point, not that old, but he calls the 19-year-old dear sir. And so letters to a young poet, and he says, I would like to beg you, dear sir, as well as I can, to have patience with everything unresolved in your heart, and to try to love the questions themselves. That's oftentimes the quote that you hear, love the questions themselves. Have patience with everything unresolved in your heart, and try to love the questions themselves, as if they were locked rooms or books written in a very foreign language. Don't search for the answers which could not be given to you now, because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps then, someday, far in the future, you will gradually, without even noticing it, live your way into the answer. I love this encouragement to not know, this non-judgmental awareness. And the sense that maybe we aren't able to know from our particular vantage point, and maybe at some point in the future it will become clear. But loving the questions rather than the answers. So would it be possible with this practice to meet myself where I am in this moment and love rather than judge. To have what, this translation of mindfulness is loving awareness, rather than engaging in this comparing mind of I need to be better or working on that. Of what if I'm just failing, and failing is the best thing I can do because I'm trying to create a whole new way of being in the world. There aren't any instructions for this model. And so I think we have the seeds within ourselves, and we're just trying to figure out how to, take care of the garden of our hearts, the garden of our being, knowing when to water, knowing when to weed. And it's all this part of this process. And everybody else is trying to do the same thing. And so, we're kind of run into it with each other for so many different reasons. And so I hope that with some of these words today that perhaps you've sparked some questions, because that's what I like to do, is spark questions. And I'm sure that lots of you have ideas, and maybe you have some reflections that you can share with each other about ways that you have sometimes felt like maybe that you haven't done well, but that you have learned. Perhaps some of the ways that maybe you thought like was a wrong turn actually opened up to a beautiful way of being, especially when it comes to what we've been taught in mainstream society for how to be in the world.